In the waning days of October 1891, the town of Millerville, Pennsylvania, was already shrouded in the gloom of another coal-stained autumn, but nothing in its long, hard history could have prepared its people for the horror that would soon be uncovered beneath the crumbling floorboards of the old opera house. It began with a rumor, a whisper passed from miner to shopkeeper, from housewife to priest, of strange noises and flickering lights in the abandoned building at the edge of town. When local authorities finally forced open the heavy cellar doors, what they found inside would haunt Millerville for generations. 17 men, women, and children were discovered chained in the darkness, their bodies marked by years of captivity and unspeakable abuse. The most chilling detail: every one of them had been declared dead, some for months, others for years, by official records in 3 different counties. The man at the center of this nightmare was Cornelius Vaneir, a charismatic showman whose traveling circus, Vaneir Cabinet of Wonders, had delighted crowds across Pennsylvania for more than a decade. But behind the laughter and applause, Vaneir had built an empire of exploitation, aided by corrupt officials and a network of silence that stretched far beyond Millerville's borders. The local newspaper was forbidden from printing the full story. Witnesses were threatened, and the case files were sealed, locked away from public view for more than 30 years. Only fragments of the truth survived in whispered confessions and yellowed letters, passed down by those who could not forget what they had seen. Tonight, we open those files and step into the shadows of America's forgotten past. Before we descend into the darkness of Vaneir's Cabinet of Wonders, I want to ask you what draws you to stories like this. Is it curiosity, outrage, or something deeper? Subscribe to Unseen Anthology and let us know where you're listening from. Now, let's return to Millerville, Pennsylvania, and uncover the truth behind one of the most disturbing discoveries in American history. Millerville in 1891 was a town balanced on the edge of 2 worlds. The old Pennsylvania countryside, with its patchwork of German farms and stone churches, was slowly being overtaken by the relentless march of industry. Cold dust settled on every surface, and the newly built railroad brought both prosperity and a steady stream of strangers. In this place where fortunes could change overnight, people learned to mind their own business. It was a habit that Cornelius Vaneir exploited with chilling precision. Vaneir arrived in Millerville in the winter of 1887, a tall, impeccably dressed man with a booming laugh and a wallet thick enough to buy silence. He purchased the abandoned opera house on the edge of town, claiming it would serve as winter quarters for his traveling show, Vaneir's Cabinet of Wonders. The townsfolk were charmed by his generosity. He donated to the church, paid his bills in gold, and always had a kind word for the children who gathered to watch the circus wagons roll in each spring. The Cabinet of Wonders was, on the surface, a marvel. Acrobats soared through the air, animals performed impossible tricks, and the freak show drew crowds from miles around. There was Eliza, the boned serpent woman, whose body twisted in ways that defied belief. There was Johann, the Bavarian colossus, who could bend iron bars with his bare hands. And there was Mary Catherine, the singing angel, whose haunting voice brought tears to the eyes of even the hardest men. But behind the curtain, the truth was far darker. Many of the performers had not joined the show willingly. Vaneir, with the help of his business partner, the enigmatic Dr. Heinrich Kellerman, and the town's own Sheriff Cromwell, had built a network for acquiring talent. They targeted the vulnerable orphans, immigrants, people with disabilities, or those simply down on their luck. Kellerman, posing as a doctor, would offer free medical exams or treatments, a dose of laudanum, or a carefully mixed sedative, and the victim would awaken in the opera house basement, chained to the wall. Their old life erased by forged death certificates and threats of violence. The process was systematic. New captives were stripped of their names and given new identities, their pasts rewritten to fit the needs of the show. They were told their families had abandoned them, that the world believed them dead. Some, like Eliza, had been held for years, their sense of self slowly eroded by isolation, drugs, and psychological manipulation. Others, like Mary Catherine, had been lured by the promise of fame, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare. The townspeople, for the most part, saw only what they wanted to see. Vaneir's money kept the sheriff quiet, and the occasional disappearance was explained away as the misfortune of a hard life. The Cabinet of Wonders became a fixture in Millerville. Its performers both celebrated and pitied, their suffering hidden in plain sight. The first crack in Vaneir's carefully constructed world came not from the authorities, but from within. On a cold October night, a young woman named Sarah managed to escape her cell. Malnourished and delirious, she stumbled through the streets until she found her way to the office of Thomas Fairchild, editor of the Millerville Weekly Gazette. Her story was fragmented, her memories clouded by trauma and drugs, but the details she provided were too specific to ignore. She spoke of chains, of a man with needles, of a ledger that listed names and prices. Fairchild, skeptical but intrigued, began to investigate. He found patterns in the death certificates, noticed the correlation between the circus's visits and the disappearances, and realized that the town's most respected men were complicit in something monstrous. But Millerville was a place where secrets were kept, and Fairchild soon found himself in danger. Sheriff Cromwell, desperate to protect his own interests, threatened him with violence, making it clear that some questions were better left uncaged yet. Yet, the truth had begun to unravel. Sarah's escape set in motion a chain of events that would expose the horrors beneath the opera house and bring Vaneir's empire crashing down. But for the captives, still chained in the darkness, rescue was far from certain. The machinery of corruption and cruelty that had kept them imprisoned for years was not so easily dismantled. Thomas Fairchild's world changed the night Sarah stumbled into his office. He had seen hardship in Millerville miners, crushed in Caven's children, lost to fever, families ruined by the whims of the coal market, but nothing had prepared him for the terror in Sarah's eyes. She spoke in broken phrases, her voice raw from screaming, her hands trembling as she clutched a chipped mug of water. "They're still down there," she whispered, in the dark. "The chains are too heavy. He told us we were dead." Fairchild listened, torn between skepticism and a growing sense of dread. Sarah described the basement of the opera house in chilling detail, the maze of windowless rooms, the heavy iron shackles, the routine of injections and bitter medicine. She named other captives: Johann, the gentle giant; Mary Catherine, the singer with no arms; Eliza, the contortionist. She spoke of Dr. Kellerman, the man with the needles, and of Cornelius Vaneir, who called them his investments. Most disturbing of all, she insisted that Vaneir kept a ledger, a book that listed every performer, their origins, and the price paid for each. The next morning, Fairchild began to investigate. He combed through old death notices and missing persons reports, cross-referencing names and dates with the circus's travel schedule. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever Vaneir's Cabinet of Wonders performed, people vanished always, those on the margins, always those who would not be missed. Fairchild's hands shook as he realized the scale of the operation. This was not a case of simple cruelty or greed. It was a system, a machine that turned human suffering into profit. But Millerville was a town built on silence. When Fairchild approached Sheriff Cromwell with his suspicions, he was met with thinly veiled threats. Cromwell, a man whose authority was rarely questioned, made it clear that Fairchild's curiosity could be fatal. "You're going to forget everything that girl told you," the sheriff said, his voice cold. Men disappear all the time in towns like this. Undeterred, Fairchild turned to the only weapon he had left, the truth. He began to document everything: Sarah's testimony, the suspicious deaths, the connections between Vaneir, Kellerman, and Cromwell. He wrote letters to contacts in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, hoping to draw the attention of authorities beyond Millerville's reach. He knew he was running out of time, Sarah's escape had not gone unnoticed, and Vaneir's men were already searching for her. Meanwhile, in the basement of the opera house, the captives sensed that something had changed. The routines grew harsher, the punishments more severe. Dr. Kellerman increased the doses of sedatives, and Vaneir prowled the corridors at night, his footsteps echoing like a warning. The performers clung to hope in whispered conversations, passing news of Sarah's escape from cell to cell. For the first time in years, the possibility of rescue seemed real, but Vaneir was not a man to be caught off guard. He had spent years perfecting his methods, building a network of corrupt officials and loyal enforcers. When he learned of Fairchild's investigation, he activated what he called the emergency protocol. The plan was simple: eliminate all evidence, including the captives themselves, and disappear before the authorities could act. As the days ticked by, Fairchild and Sarah worked together to plan a daring infiltration of the opera house. Their goal was not just to rescue the captives, but to gather irrefutable proof of Vaneir's crimes. They would photograph the basement, document the conditions, and, if possible, steal the ledger. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. What neither of them knew was that Dr. Kellerman, ever watchful, had begun to suspect that Sarah's escape was not as accidental as it seemed. He inventoried his medical supplies and discovered missing vials of chloroform and photographic chemicals. The realization that someone was planning to expose the operation sent him into a panic. He alerted Vaneir and Cromwell, and together they began to prepare for the final, brutal act of their enterprise. The night of the infiltration arrived with a cold, relentless rain that turned Millerville's streets to rivers of mud. Fairchild and Sarah moved through the shadows, hearts pounding, every step a risk. They entered the opera house through a basement window Sarah had left unlatched during her escape. The air inside was thick with the stench of human misery and washed bodies, mold, and something sweet and chemical that Fairchild would later recognize as chloroform. Armed with a small lantern and Fairchild's camera, they navigated the labyrinth of cells. The captives were in worse condition than Sarah had described. Some were barely conscious, their eyes glazed from drugs and exhaustion. Others, like Johann, the once mighty giant, were reduced to skeletal figures, their wrists and ankles raw from years of shackles. Mary Catherine, the singer, could only whisper, her voice ruined by forced performances and Kellerman's experiments. Eliza, the contortionist, stared at the wall, rocking gently, lost in a world of her own. Sarah moved from cell to cell, whispering encouragement, urging the others to hold on. Fairchild worked quickly, photographing the chains, the filth, the faces of the captives. In the old wine cellar, they found Kellerman's laboratory, a nightmare of glass bottles, syringes, and notebooks filled with notes on behavioral modification and psychological reconstruction. The evidence was overwhelming, but the most damning proof was still to come. In Vaneir's office, hidden behind a false panel, they found the ledger. Its pages were a catalog of horror, names, origins, prices, and fates of every performer acquired for the Cabinet of Wonders. 17 were listed as active, 26 more were marked as discontinued, a word that, in Vaneir's hand, meant dead or sold to other shows. Fairchild's hands shook as he photographed the pages, knowing that this book would be the key to exposing the entire operation. But as they worked, a sound from the stairs froze them in place. Heavy footsteps, muffled voices. Vaneir and his men were coming. The sweet odor of chloroform grew stronger. Kellerman had begun pumping the chemical into the basement's ventilation, hoping to subdue any would-be intruders or rebellious captives. Sarah collapsed first, her body crumpling to the floor. Fairchild, fighting the haze, managed to grab his camera and the most important ledger pages before his vision blurred and darkness closed in. The last thing he saw was Cornelius Vaneir, lantern in one hand, revolver in the other, descending the stairs with Sheriff Cromwell and Dr. Kellerman close behind. Fairchild's final thought before losing consciousness was that he and Sarah were about to become the next entries in the ledger, discontinued, erased, forgotten. When Fairchild awoke, he was chained in a cell, his camera and evidence gone. Sarah was nearby, still unconscious. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and fear. Vaneir, Kellerman, and Cromwell took turns interrogating him, demanding to know who else was involved, what evidence he had gathered, and whether he had contacted anyone outside Millerville. Their methods were brutal beatings, threats, and psychological torment. Vaneir, ever the showman, even mused about turning Fairchild into a performer, the melancholy gentleman, driven mad by forbidden knowledge. But even as he suffered, Fairchild listened, gathering information. He learned that Vaneir's network extended far beyond Millerville, with contacts in 6 states and private exhibitions for wealthy clients. The plan was to kill all the captives, destroy the evidence, and vanish before the authorities arrived. It was a race against time, and Fairchild knew that his only hope was that someone, somewhere, would realize what was happening before it was too late. While Fairchild endured the horrors of captivity, events outside the opera house were quietly shifting, unbeknownst to Vaneir and his conspirators. Fairchild's last desperate letters had reached Margaret Dalton, his former colleague at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Dalton was no stranger to danger or corruption. She had built her career exposing the secrets of powerful men. When Fairchild's correspondence abruptly stopped, she grew suspicious. She began making inquiries, contacting federal authorities, and forwarding copies of Fairchild's letters to trusted colleagues in Pittsburgh and New York. Dalton's network ensured that, even if Millerville's officials tried to suppress the story, the truth would not die with Fairchild inside the opera house. The atmosphere was tense and volatile. Dr. Kellerman, increasingly paranoid, watched every move, convinced that the operation was on the verge of collapse. Peter, his nervous assistant, was racked with guilt. He had seen too much, and the prospect of helping to murder 17 captives was more than his conscience could bear. As Kellerman prepared massive doses of poison, Peter made a fateful decision. He slipped away and ran to the home of Reverend Samuel Brooks, one of the few men in Millerville untouched by Vaneir's influence. Brooks listened to Peter's frantic confession, at first dismissing it as madness. But Peter's detailed knowledge of the opera house and the captives convinced him otherwise. Together, they devised a plan. Brooks would send urgent telegrams to the Pennsylvania State Police and the governor's office, while Peter would return to the opera house and delay Kellerman's deadly preparations as long as possible. Meanwhile, Fairchild, battered but not broken, worked on his own escape. He noticed that the anchor bolt securing his chains was set in crumbling masonry. Using every ounce of strength, he worked the bolt loose, timing his efforts to avoid detection during the guards' rounds. The process was agonizingly slow, but as the night wore on, the bolt finally gave way. Fairchild was free, but the real challenge was just beginning. He crept through the basement, freeing Sarah and as many other captives as he could. Many were too weak or traumatized to move, but Sarah's earlier escape had given her credibility. She coaxed and encouraged the others, helping Fairchild convince them that this was their only chance. The group moved cautiously, every sound a potential alarm. Upstairs, Peter's delaying tactics bought precious time, but Kellerman's suspicions were growing. As dawn approached, the first state police officers arrived in Millerville, responding to Brooks's telegrams. At the same time, Fairchild and Sarah led a small group of captives toward the basement stairs, only to be confronted by Vaneir, Cromwell, and several armed men. The confrontation was chaotic shouts, gunshots, the crash of furniture. In the confusion, Peter managed to warn Fairchild of a side exit, and Sarah helped guide the weakest captives to safety. The turning point came when Reverend Brooks arrived at the opera house with the police. Cromwell, desperate to maintain his authority, tried to bluff his way through, but the officers had already been briefed on the corruption in Millerville. As more police poured into the building, Vaneir and Kellerman retreated to the office, barricading themselves inside and attempting to destroy the remaining evidence. But it was too late. Fairchild had already hidden the most damning photographs and ledger pages, and the testimony of the survivors was overwhelming. The Opera House, once a place of spectacle and illusion, became the stage for a final reckoning. As the sun rose over Millerville, the truth could no longer be hidden. The captives, their chains finally broken, emerged into the light, living proof of the horrors that had festered in the town's shadows for years. The aftermath of the Opera House raid sent shockwaves through Millerville and far beyond. The sight of 17 emaciated, traumatized survivors, people who had been declared dead, now blinking in the morning light, was enough to shatter the town's carefully maintained silence. News spread quickly, first by word of mouth, then in headlines that reached Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and eventually the entire nation. The Millerville Opera House, once a symbol of entertainment and community, was now infamous as the site of one of the most grotesque crimes in American history. Authorities moved swiftly. Cornelius, Vaneir, and Dr. Kellerman were arrested on the spot, their attempts to destroy evidence thwarted by the quick thinking of Fairchild and the survivors. Sheriff Cromwell, realizing his power had evaporated, tried to negotiate a deal, but the state police had no interest in bargains. The captives were rushed to a makeshift infirmary, where doctors and nurses worked around the clock to treat malnutrition, infections, and the psychological wounds that would take far longer to heal. Fairchild, though battered and exhausted, became the central figure in the investigation. His photographs, notes, and the rescued ledger provided a roadmap for prosecutors. Margaret Dalton arrived from Philadelphia, bringing with her a team of journalists and federal agents. She interviewed survivors, documented their stories, and ensured that the case would not be buried by local corruption. For the first time, the voices of the victims were heard. The survivors' testimonies painted a picture of systematic cruelty. They described how Vaneir and Kellerman had stripped them of their identities, forced them to perform, and convinced them that the outside world had forgotten them. Some spoke of the private exhibitions for wealthy clients' nights, when the abuse turned even darker. An escape seemed impossible. Others recalled the small acts of kindness that had kept them alive: a whispered word of hope, a stolen crust of bread, a song sung in the darkness. The town itself was forced to confront its complicity. Many had profited from Vaneir's generosity, accepted his donations, or simply looked the other way. Now, as the truth emerged, shame and anger mingled in the streets. Some called for the Opera House to be burned to the ground. Others demanded justice for the officials who had enabled the crimes. Reverend Brooks, who had risked his life to help Peter and the captives, became a symbol of the town's conscience, a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and compassion could make a difference. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented. Vaneir faced dozens of charges, from kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment to murder and human trafficking. Kellerman, confronted with overwhelming evidence and the testimonies of his victims, confessed to his role in the operation. Cromwell, desperate to save himself, turned state's witness, revealing the extent of the corruption that had allowed Vaneir's cabinet of wonders to flourish for so long. As the trials began, the survivors struggled to rebuild their lives. Some returned to families who had never stopped searching for them. Others, with no one left, found support in each other and in the community that had once failed them. Sarah, whose escape had set the entire chain of events in motion, became an advocate for victims of human trafficking, determined to ensure that no one else would suffer as she had. The story of Millerville became a national sensation, a cautionary tale about the dangers of indifference and the power of truth. But for those who had lived through the nightmare, the scars would never fully fade. The Opera House was eventually demolished, replaced by a small memorial garden. Yet, the memory of what happened there would linger, for generations a reminder that evil can thrive in silence, and that the most important stories are often the hardest to tell. The trials of Cornelius Vaneir, Dr. Heinrich Kellerman, and Sheriff Cromwell became a spectacle that drew crowds from across Pennsylvania. Reporters filled the courthouse, sketch artists captured every grimace and tear, and the survivors once hidden in darkness were now thrust into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The proceedings revealed the full extent of the Cabinet of Wonders horrors, the forged death certificates, the network of corrupt officials, the private exhibitions for the wealthy, and the systematic breaking of human bodies and spirits for profit. Vaneir, ever the showman, tried to maintain his composure. He denied nothing, instead attempting to justify his actions as business and entertainment. He spoke of the cabinet as a family, of the opportunities he had given to those unfit for the world outside. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the testimonies of the survivors were devastating. Eliza, the bone serpent woman, described years of pain and humiliation. Johann, the Bavarian colossus, struggled to speak, but his presence is ruined. Body spoke volumes. Mary Catherine, her voice forever damaged, sang a broken hymn that brought the courtroom to tears. Kellerman, faced with the mountain of evidence and the prospect of a death sentence, confessed in detail. He described how he had used his knowledge of chemistry and medicine to keep the captives docile, how he had falsified records and manipulated the authorities. His confession implicated dozens of other officials, doctors, and businessmen who had profited from the cabinet's existence. Cromwell, in a last-ditch effort to save himself, corroborated Kellerman's account, exposing the rot that had spread through Millerville's institutions. The verdicts were swift and severe. Vaneir was sentenced to death, Kellerman to life imprisonment, and Cromwell to 20 years. The trials set legal precedents for the prosecution of human trafficking and organized abuse, and the case became a rallying point for reform. New laws were passed, requiring stricter oversight of traveling shows and better protections for vulnerable populations. The Cabinet of Wonders was dismantled, its name forever associated with cruelty and exploitation. For the survivors, justice was bittersweet. Freedom brought its own challenges: physical rehabilitation, psychological healing, and the struggle to reclaim stolen identities. Some, like Sarah, found purpose in advocacy, working with law enforcement and charities to prevent future atrocities. Others, like Johann, retreated from public life, seeking solace in the quiet routines of ordinary existence. Mary Catherine, her voice a shadow of what it once was, became a teacher, using music to help other children find hope in the aftermath of trauma. Millerville itself was transformed. The Opera House, once a symbol of the town's prosperity, was torn down, replaced by a memorial garden. The townspeople, shamed by their complicity, worked to support the survivors and rebuild their community. Reverend Brooks led efforts to establish a fund for the victims, and Margaret Dalton's articles inspired similar investigations in other towns, exposing a network of exploitation that stretched far beyond Pennsylvania. Yet, even as the town healed, questions lingered. How many other cabinets of wonders existed, hidden behind the facades of respectability and entertainment? How many victims remained lost, their stories untold? The case became a warning, a reminder that evil often wears a friendly face, and that silence is its greatest ally. As the years passed, the survivors' stories became legend, retold in newspapers, books, and whispered conversations. The Cabinet of Wonders faded into history, but its lessons endured. In the end, the greatest victory was not the punishment of the guilty, but the restoration of the living, the return of 17 souls to the world that had once forgotten them. In the months following the trial, Millerville struggled to find its footing. The town's name had become synonymous with scandal, and the shame of what had happened beneath the Opera House lingered in every conversation. Yet, amid the sorrow, there were signs of resilience. The survivors, once stripped of their identities and voices, began to reclaim their lives in small but meaningful ways. Sarah Henley, whose courage had sparked the investigation, became a symbol of hope. She spoke at churches and town meetings, her story a testament to the power of survival and the importance of vigilance. She worked closely with Margaret Dalton, who published a series of articles exposing not only the horrors of the Cabinet of Wonders but also the failures of the community that had allowed it to flourish. Their partnership inspired other journalists and activists to look more closely at the hidden corners of their own towns. For some survivors, healing was a slow and solitary process. Johann Brenner, the Bavarian colossus, found work as a handyman in Philadelphia, supported by a local church that had followed his story in the papers. Though he rarely spoke of his ordeal, his gentle presence and quiet strength made him a beloved figure in his new community. Eliza, the Bone Serpent Woman, moved to New York, where she found acceptance among other performers who understood the pain of exploitation. She used her earnings to support charities for disabled children, determined to turn her suffering into something good. Mary Catherine, the singing angel, never fully regained her voice, but she became a mentor to young musicians, teaching them not only music, but also the value of compassion and courage. Her letters to other survivors became a lifeline, a network of support that stretched across the country. Together, they shared their struggles and triumphs, refusing to let their past define their futures. The legal reforms inspired by the Millerville case began to take root. Traveling shows were now subject to regular inspections, and performers were required to carry documentation proving their voluntary participation. Law enforcement agencies established new protocols for investigating missing persons, especially those from marginalized communities. The case also led to the creation of advocacy organizations dedicated to protecting the rights of people with disabilities and immigrants, groups that had been most vulnerable to Vaneir's predations. Yet, for all the progress, the scars of the Cabinet of Wonders remained. Some townspeople struggled to forgive themselves for their silence, while others clung to denial, insisting that they could not have known what was happening beneath their feet. The memorial garden at the site of the old opera house became a place of reflection, a reminder of the cost of indifference and the necessity of courage. As the years passed, the story of Millerville faded from the headlines, but it lived on in the memories of those who had survived and those who had learned from their suffering. The Cabinet of Wonders was gone, but its lessons endured a warning that evil thrives in darkness, and that the most important stories are those that demand to be told. As the new century dawned, the legacy of Millerville's tragedy continued to ripple outward. The survivors, scattered across Pennsylvania and beyond, became living reminders of both the cruelty that had been inflicted and the resilience that had carried them through. Their names, once erased from official records, were now spoken with respect in courtrooms, classrooms, and homes. The story of the Cabinet of Wonders was retold in sermons and school lessons, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of community vigilance. Margaret Dalton's investigative work did not end with the trial. She traveled to other towns, following rumors of missing persons and suspicious entertainments. Her articles exposed similar abuses in neighboring states, leading to further arrests and the rescue of more victims. Dalton's relentless pursuit of the truth inspired a new generation of journalists, many of them women, who saw in her a model of courage and integrity. Her partnership with Sarah Henley became legendary, and together they advocated for national reforms in the treatment of performers and the treatment trafficking. Meanwhile, the survivors forged new paths. Some, like Eliza and Mary Catherine, found purpose in helping others. Eliza established a home for disabled children in New York, using her notoriety to raise funds and awareness. Mary Catherine, though her voice never fully returned, became a beloved music teacher, her gentle spirit a balm to those who had suffered. Johann, the gentle giant, lived quietly, his strength now devoted to building gardens and repairing homes for the poor. The town of Millerville, once defined by its silence, became a place of remembrance and renewal. The memorial garden at the side of the Opera House grew into a sanctuary, tended by townspeople who had once looked away. Each year, on the anniversary of the rescue, the community gathered to honor the survivors and mourn the lost. The names of the 17 who had been found, and the 26 who had not, were read aloud, their stories woven into the fabric of the town's identity. Legal reforms continued to spread. State legislatures passed new laws requiring background checks for those working with vulnerable populations, and federal agencies began to coordinate efforts to track and prevent human trafficking. The Millerville case was cited in legal textbooks and police academies, its lessons shaping the next generation of law enforcement and social workers. Yet, even as progress was made, the darkness that had allowed the Cabinet of Wonders to exist was never entirely banished. Dalton's investigations revealed that similar operations still flourished in the shadows, protected by the same forces of greed, prejudice, and indifference. The fight for justice was ongoing, and the survivors knew that their stories were both a warning and a call to action. For Sarah Henley, the journey was far from over. She traveled with Dalton, speaking at rallies and hearings, her voice steady and clear. "We were forgotten once," she told crowds, "but we will not be forgotten again." Our suffering was real, but so is our hope. We are here to remind you that every life matters, and that silence is never the answer. By the early 1900s, the Millerville case had become a touchstone for reformers and a source of uneasy pride for the town itself. The survivors' stories were now part of the region's folklore, recounted in newspapers, at family gatherings, and in the growing number of advocacy meetings held in church basements and town halls. The memorial garden, once a simple patch of earth, had blossomed into a place of pilgrimage. People came from miles around to lay flowers, to read the names etched in stone, and to reflect on the cost of looking away. Sarah Henley, now in her 30s, had become a national figure. Her testimony before Congress helped shape new federal laws on human trafficking and the regulation of traveling shows. She worked tirelessly with Margaret Dalton, whose articles continued to expose abuses in other states. Together, they lobbied for the creation of a national registry of missing persons and for the establishment of safe houses for those escaping exploitation. Their efforts bore fruit. By 1905, several states had passed laws requiring regular inspections of circuses and sideshows, and the first federal task force on human trafficking was formed. For the other survivors, life was a patchwork of healing and struggle. Eliza, the bone serpent woman, became a sought-after speaker, her story a rallying cry for disability rights. She traveled the country, urging lawmakers to see the humanity in those who were different, and to protect them from exploitation. Johann, though still haunted by nightmares, found peace in his work and in the friendships he forged in his new community. Mary Catherine, her voice now a soft whisper, wrote a memoir that became a bestseller, its pages filled with both sorrow and hope. Millerville itself changed in ways both subtle and profound. The old opera house was gone, but the town's new library stood on its foundations, its reading room lined with portraits of the survivors. The annual remembrance ceremony became a day of unity, drawing together people of all backgrounds to honor the past and commit to vigilance in the present. The town's children grew up hearing the story not as a tale of shame, but as a lesson in courage and the power of speaking out. Yet, for all the progress, the shadow of the Cabinet of Wonders lingered. Dalton's investigations revealed that, despite new laws and greater awareness, exploitation still thrived in the margins among the poor, the disabled, the immigrant. The survivors knew that their story was not unique, and that the fight for justice was never truly finished. Sarah, Eliza, and Mary Catherine remained in close contact, their letters a lifeline through the years. They shared news of new rescues, mourned the losses of those who could not be saved, and celebrated each small victory. Their bond, forged in the darkness of the opera house basement, became a beacon for others who had suffered in silence. As the 20th century unfolded, the legacy of Millerville endured. The Cabinet of Wonders was gone, but its lessons remained a warning against complacency, a call to compassion, and a reminder that the most important stories are those that refuse to be forgotten. As the years passed, the story of Cabinet of Wonders became woven into the broader tapestry of American history. The survivors, once hidden away and silenced, were now honored guests at conferences and commemorations. Their testimonies were recorded for posterity, their faces appearing in early newsreels, and later, in the pages of history books. The world was changing slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, the lessons of Millerville were helping to shape that change. Sarah Henley, now a seasoned advocate, traveled the country with Margaret Dalton, speaking at universities, women's clubs, and legislative hearings. Their partnership was legendary, a symbol of what could be achieved when courage and truth worked hand in hand. Sarah's speeches, once halting and uncertain, now rang with conviction. "We are not curiosities," she would say, "and we are not forgotten. Our suffering was real, but so is our hope. We demand to be seen, to be heard, and to be protected." Eliza, the Bone Serpent Woman, continued her work with disabled children, her home in New York a haven for those who had nowhere else to go. She became a mentor to a new generation of performers, teaching them not only the art of the stage, but also the importance of dignity and self. Her story inspired the founding of the first national organization for the rights of people with disabilities, a cause that would grow in strength throughout the 20th century. Mary Catherine, though her voice never fully recovered, found new ways to share her music. She composed songs for children's choirs, her melodies filled with both sorrow and hope. Her memoir, Songs from the Shadows, became a touchstone for survivors of trauma. Its pages a testament to the power of resilience and the healing force of art. Millerville itself became a model for other towns grappling with the legacy of exploitation. The annual remembrance ceremony grew into a regional event, drawing visitors from across the state. The library, built on the site of the old opera house, became a center for education and advocacy, its shelves filled with books on justice, human rights, and the history of the Cabinet of Wonders. The Memorial Garden, once a place of mourning, was now a place of hope, its flowers tended by the children and grandchildren of those who had survived. Yet, even as the world moved forward, the darkness that had once hidden in Millerville's basement was never entirely banished. Dalton's investigations continued to uncover new cases of abuse and exploitation, reminding everyone that vigilance was always necessary. The survivors, now elders, passed their stories on to the next generation, urging them to remember the past and to fight for a future where no one would be chained in the dark. The Cabinet of Wonders was gone, but its lessons endured, a warning against the dangers of silence, a call to action for all who believed in justice, and a reminder that, even in the darkest places, hope can take root and bloom. By the 1920s, the world had changed in ways the survivors of Millerville's Cabinet of Wonders could scarcely have imagined. Automobiles rumbled down the main street, electric lights glowed in windows, and the town's children grew up in a place that prided itself on vigilance and compassion. Yet, for those who had lived through the opera house's horrors, the past was never far away. Their scars visible and invisible remained, but so did their determination to ensure that history would not repeat itself. Sarah Henley, now in her 50s, was a respected figure in state politics. She had helped draft some of the first comprehensive laws against human trafficking and exploitation, her name appearing in legal journals and advocacy pamphlets. She continued to work with Margaret Dalton, whose investigative reporting had become a model for journalists nationwide. Together, they trained a new generation of reporters and activists, teaching them how to spot the signs of abuse and how to give voice to the voiceless. Eliza, now known as Miss Eliza to the children she cared for, ran a thriving home for disabled youth in upstate New York. Her story was featured in magazines and radio broadcasts, and she was often invited to speak at conferences on disability rights. She never forgot the pain of her captivity, but she used it to fuel her mission, to ensure that no child would ever again be treated as a spectacle or a commodity. Mary Catherine, though her health was fragile, continued to compose music and write letters to survivors across the country. Her home became a gathering place for artists, musicians, and writers, many of whom had their own stories of hardship and survival. Her songs, once sung in the darkness of the Opera House basement, now echoed in concert halls and churches. A testament to the enduring power of hope, Millerville itself had become a symbol of transformation. The annual remembrance ceremony was now broadcast on the radio, and the town schools taught the story of the Cabinet of Wonders as part of their curriculum. The library and memorial garden were places of pilgrimage, visited by people from all walks of life who came to honor the survivors and to learn from the past. Yet, even as the survivors found new purpose, they knew that the fight was not over. Dalton's investigations revealed that exploitation still existed, often hidden behind new facades. Traveling shows were now regulated, but other forms of abuse had taken their place. The survivors urged lawmakers and citizens alike to remain vigilant, to speak out against injustice, and to remember that evil thrives in silence. As the decade drew to a close, the survivors gathered in Millerville for the 30th anniversary of their rescue. They stood together in the memorial garden, surrounded by friends, family, and supporters. Sarah spoke first, her voice steady and clear. "We are not defined by what was done to us, but by what we do with our freedom. Let our story be a promise. We survived, and we will not let the world forget." The Cabinet of Wonders was gone, but its legacy lived on in the laws that protected the vulnerable, in the voices that refused to be silenced, and in the hearts of those who believed that even the darkest night can give way to dawn. As the decades passed, the story of Millerville's Cabinet of Wonders became a touchstone for generations who had never seen the old Opera House or met the survivors in person. The annual remembrance grew into a statewide event, with descendants of the rescued and the rescuers gathering to honor the legacy of courage, vigilance, and hard-won justice. School children recited the names of the 17 who had been found, and the 26 who had not, their voices rising in the spring air as a promise to remember Sarah Henley. Now, an elder stateswoman watched with pride as her life's work bore fruit. She saw new laws passed, new shelters opened, and a new culture of accountability take root. She was often asked to speak at universities and conferences, her words carrying the weight of lived experience. "Evil is never just one man or one place," she would say. "It is a shadow that moves where it is allowed. Our duty is to shine a light, to speak for those who cannot, and to never let comfort become complicity." Margaret Dalton, her hair now silver, continued to write, her pen as sharp as ever. She published a memoir that became required reading for journalists and advocates, detailing not only the horrors she had uncovered, but also the failures and redemptions of the community. Her partnership with Sarah was celebrated as a model of what could be achieved when truth and courage worked together. Eliza's home for disabled children expanded, its gardens filled with laughter and music. She trained new caregivers, teaching them not only the skills of their trade, but also the importance of empathy and respect. Her legacy was not just in the children she saved, but in the generations of advocates and caregivers who followed her example. Mary Catherine, though her health declined, continued to inspire through her music and her letters. Her songs were sung at remembrance ceremonies, her words quoted in speeches and sermons. She died peacefully, surrounded by friends and former students. Her life a testament to the healing power of art and community. Millerville itself had changed, beyond recognition. The cold dust was gone, replaced by clean streets and thriving businesses. The library and memorial garden remained at the heart of the town, symbols of both the darkness that had once hidden there and the light that had driven it out. The story of the Cabinet of Wonders was no longer a source of shame, but a lesson in vigilance and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Yet, even as the survivors passed into history, their message endured. New threats arose, new forms of exploitation emerged, but the people of Millerville and those who learned from their story remained watchful. The Cabinet of Wonders was gone, but its warning echoed through the years. Evil thrives in silence, and the most important stories are those that demand to be told. By the time the last of the original survivors passed away, the Cabinet of Wonders had become more than a cautionary tale. It was a living legacy. The Memorial Garden in Millerville, once a quiet patch of earth, now hosted visitors from across the country. School groups came to lay flowers, advocacy groups held vigils, and descendants of the rescued and the rescuers gathered to share stories and renew their commitment to justice. The town's annual remembrance was broadcast on radio and, later, television. The names of the 17 who had survived and the 26 who had not were read aloud, their stories woven into the fabric of American memory. The library, built on the site of the old Opera House, became a center for research and advocacy, its archives filled with letters, photographs, and the testimony of those who had lived through the darkness. Sarah Henley's legacy lived on in the laws she helped shape and the organizations she inspired. Her portrait hung in the state capitol, a reminder that one voice, raised in courage, can change the course of history. Margaret Dalton's writings continued to guide journalists and reformers, her insistence on truth and accountability echoing in every newsroom and courtroom where the vulnerable sought justice. Eliza's home for disabled children became a model for care and compassion, its gardens a sanctuary for those who needed healing. The children she saved grew up to become teachers, advocates, and caregivers themselves, carrying forward her lessons of empathy and resilience. Mary Catherine's music, preserved in recordings and songbooks, continued to inspire her melodies, a testament to the power of hope in the face of suffering. Millerville, once a town defined by silence and complicity, became a beacon of vigilance. Its people understood that evil does not vanish, but must be confronted again and again, in every generation. The Cabinet of Wonders was gone, but its lessons endured, a warning against complacency, a call to action, and a reminder that the most important stories are those that refuse to be forgotten. As the sun set over the memorial garden, the voices of children rose in song, their words carrying across the fields and into the future. We remember, we speak, we protect. And so, the story of Millerville lived on, not as a tale of horror, but as a promise that darkness can be overcome, and that the light of truth, once kindled, can never be extinguished. What do you think of this story? Do you believe every secret was truly revealed, or are there still shadows left unexplored? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this tale as chilling as we did, subscribe to Unseen Anthology, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves dark mysteries. The horrors of Millerville remind us that the most terrifying monsters in history are often human, and that silence and indifference can be just as dangerous as cruelty. Join us next time as we uncover more forgotten horrors from America's shadowed past.